Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Making sense of the protests in Memphis tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us as we continue to do the show remotely. This week, I'm very pleased to be joined by Faith Morris. She is Chief Marketing and External Affairs Officer for the National Civil Rights Museum. Thanks for joining us, Faith.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Along with Archie Willis, President of ComCap Partners. Archie, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Along with Bill Dries, reporter with the Daily Memphian. I'll start, I guess I'll go to you first, Faith, and just what do you take or take away from the protests and demonstrations? And it's a huge question, I know, but I would love to hear your thoughts, what you take away from it and where we go from here, particularly as a city, although obviously this is a national and international movement and issue.
You know what is clear this time, because certainly we've seen plenty of protests. We've seen plenty of movements come and go. There's been a common goal all along, but there's something different happening with this one. This has more power, more push, more resilience, and it's been going on for days. That also does not happen. Memphis is kind of setting the stage for what protests potentially should look like. You know, what we need to see now is what's going to happen after this. You know, what's the strategy behind it? Is there really a move forward to get any of what the activists are in the streets about, to see if any of that's going to happen?
Yeah. For you, Archie, what do you take away and where do we go from here?
I agree with Faith. It does seem to be a different vibe, if you will, with the protests and the follow-up that's occurring. I think also that although the general protest is focused on the incident with Mr. Floyd, that people are also recognizing and realizing that this movement goes beyond the long-term nature of police brutality in our communities, particularly against African-American men. And there are just so many social injustices and inequalities that really have to be addressed. So I think this movement is not only addressing that core issue, but also kind of setting the table, if you will, for hopefully additional conversations about much more systemic changes that need to occur throughout society as a whole.
For me, I don't know why, but I've thought a lot. I'd love to hear the optimism, and I'm optimistic as well. Not that anyone really cares what I think, but I can't stop thinking about Rodney King. And we are all old enough to remember that. That was the early 90s. It was a horrific scene of brutality on Rodney King from a helicopter. And that was, coming up on 30 years ago. And so there were protests then. And what about now changed? And there've been obviously Ferguson. I mean, there've been all these moments on cell phone video and security camera videos, and these moments of police brutality. Is it something about coronavirus, even something about the economic hit that so many people have felt, and the anxiety and uncertainty of coronavirus? And I guess I'll go to you, Faith, for that. I mean, is the backdrop making the response different?
Well, think about this. And there was this question that came up, and I absolutely, am plagued by it because I agree with it. So why is being Black in America a death sentence? And it's a death sentence across the board. We talk about what's going on with COVID. Well, and Black community is being hit harder, disproportionately harder with COVID and most health issues. And then when it comes to being arrested, I had media call and wanted to know what's going on in Germantown, because more Blacks are being arrested in Germantown for loitering and for minor offenses. That's national news trying to figure out what's happening here. That when you looked at the congressional hearing yesterday and George Floyd's brother, Philonise, you know, and it was one of the most passionate, one of the most emotional testimonies I've ever seen. And it was one that you believed that his agenda was genuine. And he said he was only there to ask Congress for justice for his brother. And what I think these activists, and there are many, and a lot of them are not in the streets right now, are looking for justice for them all, because it's happening right now. There's something happening right now. And so when you talk about being an optimist, I'm not generally an optimist because I've seen too much. I'm exposed to too much. I have to discuss too much. I have to answer for too much. Every time there's a headline, they call the museum. And so we need to be able to have a position on it and just understand all of what's happening. And until something really changes and clicks with what's happening now with COVID's rage, and it's starting all over again, and it's worse now than it was before. There's a reason for that. We've got protests going, they're wearing masks, but they're not social distancing. So it'll just be interesting what happens with this. But there's this total thing that is being considered.
Let me let Archie answer if you can or want that question, and then we'll go to Bill, which is, again, that sense of is the backdrop of COVID, of economic distress and uncertainty, is that part of the reason that this has resonated more, and it does feel different than other reactions to other equally, if not more violent actions by police that were caught on camera?
I think there is a correlation or relationship, and I think Faith described it clearly. There's such a disproportionate impact on the African-American community with the virus. So I think that's a part of it. And you mentioned the economic consequences that people are having to navigate and deal with. And of course, across the board, African-Americans have always been on a lower ladder of economic security. So when you look at the steps that we as a nation have had to take to address that made those challenges even greater. And I think there are a couple of other elements to why it might be different, particularly you mentioned Rodney King 30 years ago. So we have a whole new generation of people. My children, as an example, are all in late 20s, early 30s. So for them to see this, it's a different lens than the way I looked at it, because I was around when I saw all of the violence and the retaliation back in the 60s. They may have seen clips of Rodney King, and of course they've seen other incidents where there's been brutality, but I don't think they've ever seen a situation like we just saw with Mr. Floyd, where the police officer was just so, amazingly callous about what he did. And there's no empathy, no concern, no compassion, no humanity. And I think that resonated with people. The other thing I think that goes back to COVID is we're in a total different mindset. And it's interesting how the professional athletic community is rallied behind this. So we had the Colin Kaepernick incident, 4 or 5 years ago, and that's really mushroomed. And part of that relates to COVID, because these guys are sitting around at their houses doing whatever they're doing. They aren't actively engaged in their profession. They've always had loud voices. Their loud voices were typically, held in check for various reasons, and they had to prepare for the next game, whether it's Sunday in NFL or during the week for the basketball and baseball players. So I think it's really a combination of forces that have some relationship to COVID-19, as well as just the overall dynamics of the humanity as it existed in 2020 compared to years ago.
Let me bring Bill in.
Faith, the history that we see in the museum is a history of protest and then strategy, and then protest and then talks and more strategy. And it seems to me that within the last 5 years of of what I've kind of called our new activism, that I think you have a new generation of people who are in the streets who think and firmly believe that you can do both at the same time. It seems to be a more compressed timeline from what I've seen, in a more compressed consideration. And protest is seen by some as a way to keep people involved as opposed to part of a rhythm. Agree or disagree?
Well, the whole idea about protest is disruption. Protest is designed to bring attention to, and so that's the phase that this is in right now. I think one of the things that is clear when you look at what we do at the museum and share, Dr. King's philosophies and his legacy. One of the things that potentially is missing here is Dr. King always had legislators involved in the movement. He had legislation. The goal was to change policy. The goal was to change laws. The goal was to go to the very highest of authority to make these things happen. That's why he was in the ear of presidents. They didn't want to hear from him, that's for sure. And he made, their lives really tough. So what we're seeing now is some very young people, and they have no patience. They're tired of waiting. They're not going to wait for somebody else to figure this out. They feel that it is squarely on their shoulders to do. And now they're trying to see what their most effective next steps should be. And they bring up Dr. King all the time as an example of what they are trying to do now. The piece that potentially is missing is that line, that link to legislators and legislation.
All right, and Archie, does 2 weeks of protest provide a sufficient foundation, do you think, to get at some of the problems that you talked about in the guest column that you did for us, the problems with institutions where racism is there and has been there for quite some time?
I think the protests, as Faith mentioned, they are intended to be a disruption and to draw attention to issues. And typically we don't see 2 weeks pretty much continuous protests. Typically it's some protests in the city where the act occurs. There might be a day or two of follow-up protests in other cities, but we're seeing continuous daily protests, different groups of protesters and activists across the country and across the world. And that's a different phenomenon in terms of what we've seen in the past, where you have people in other parts of the world, in Europe, places, protesting what's happening in the United States. And for some of them, obviously, it's a point of folly because, some of those countries where people are protesting have always been accused of human rights violations themselves. So they're looking back and saying, USA, look at yourself, take a look in the mirror. So I think that's a critical element of it. So I think the 2 weeks certainly helps that. And I think this is probably going to continue a little bit longer. In terms of the other element as it relates to the op-ed is that what I was really trying to accomplish is to plant some seeds, some connected dots, if you will, with folks who are a part of the system, who benefited from this system willingly or unwillingly. And hopefully they'll recognize that they have a role to play. It's not a role of protest, but it's a role of them thinking about the institutions that they are a part of and how they function as organizations and as systems and institutions, and to really think about the advantages they've had and how those advantages have really been disadvantages for people of color. And perhaps a light bulb will go off for some of them to say, well, we need to think about or rethink about how we do certain things, how we go about interacting with the minority community, how we go about hiring people for our various organizations, how we look at trying to foster greater opportunities, educational and economic. So hopefully the protests will continue in a way that keeps the focus on the issue. It keeps a level of disruption to the point we don't want civil disobedience, and we certainly don't need, the looting and rioting and things like that, which Memphis has experienced very little of. We do need to have the attention to stay on the fact that we have these systems that have been in place since the formation of this country that really have to be looked at, and people need to start thinking about how can we make some significant changes so that folks do have a greater opportunity and an equal opportunity to participate in the benefits of being a part of this country.
And before I send this back to Eric, do you think it is a matter of not knowing or not knowing how to change? Because certainly the things that you talked about have been talked about for quite a long time.
I think it's both, Bill. I think it's, for some folks, it's not knowing, and for some folks, it's not knowing what to do. And then the other factor is it's the norm. This is what we've done. This is how we've acted for centuries. So we never really thought about the impact. And we have, some very good people doing a lot of great things to try to make life better across the board, but they never really thought about, in some cases, what they do, how they function, the systems they're involved with, the institutions and organizations they're involved with, how are they in fact perpetuating some of these things. And again, they may not be doing it willingly, but the systems have been in place for a while and they're just doing what they are accustomed to doing. It becomes the norm. So hopefully it's a realization that we haven't done enough. We haven't always recognized it, but when we have recognized it, we haven't done enough. So now we need to recognize it. And we also need to think about what tangible actions we can take to improve the situation where we do have greater equality across the board.
I was thinking, maybe I've got a faith here. For me, a huge realization in the original Black Lives after Ferguson was a national conversation about how a thing I had never realized. I'd certainly understood to whatever degree, racism and inequality, and I felt I was, if not completely versed in that, I was certainly very aware. But of course, I had no idea the fear that so many African Americans feel just to get pulled over for a broken taillight or just to get pulled over for speeding. That was a simple but profoundly eye-opening realization for me, as a middle-class white guy. I'm curious for me in the last week, one of the real profound realizations that, there's the debate about defund the police or dismantle the police departments. And whatever one thinks about that, one of the interesting, really eye-opening issues that people who talk at length about it will point out is that, if you have in America, in most cities, if you have a mentally ill person on a street corner who is acting out and maybe scaring or just dangerous to themselves or something, in America, by and large, we call the police. We don't call a mental health professional. We don't call somebody trained particularly in dealing with that. We call in, because this is just what we do, people with, guns and clubs and handcuffs to approach a mental health issue. And so I'm curious about, maybe Faith, if you can, opening our eyes to the role of police. You may want to talk about defunding the police and that whole movement, but we ask, when you step back and think about it, we ask strange things of the police that are way beyond stopping a school shooting, way beyond stopping a armed robbery in process or some sort of violent crime. How do we need to think differently about police going forward?
No, I don't know that it's a matter of defunding the police. I think it's a matter of rethinking police. That I feel like policing has stepped outside the bounds of what it was intended to do. They become the trial, the jury, the persecutors, the everything at a stoplight. And we have to make sure that that is no longer the norm. That whole driving while Black is a thing. And to be killed for things that others are not. It's not that other folks don't get pulled over for a broken tail light or not having your driver's license or selling loose cigarettes or whatever you're doing. The consequence is that if you're Black, the end is not always a good one. And that has to be changed. we hear more about systemic change now than we have. We talk about it all the time, folks that discuss this, on different platforms all the time. But these young protesters are talking about systemic change. So when we think about the role that our police should have and the role that's the reality, there's something wrong there. There's a broke there that needs to be fixed. So there needs to be an empty sheet of paper, as far as I'm concerned. An empty sheet of paper to determine what kind of protection we need our police to perform, and then go from there. We can't start with what we're doing right now and try to fix it.
Yeah. Archie, I think, again, if you bear with me in my cognitive leap maybe, but I think about public housing, and you and I have talked about that a number of times over the years. Your company have been at the forefront of completely remaking public housing in Memphis, and I think in other places, but I think it's 9 of the 10 or 11 big public housing projects that were built, in the 30s and 40s and 50s. I think Paul Young, from the head of Housing Community Development, I think I'll quote him as, public housing was originally built to warehouse the poor, and it created pockets of poverty and a lack of mobility. And the neighborhoods you and others have built are transformative, right? I mean, they're attractive, they're open, they are places to live, they are true neighborhoods, they are mixed income, they are not just warehousing simply poor people. It's a mix of rentals and people owning homes. And I was thinking about it that in a sense, what you've done, we used to look at public housing projects and be scared of them and see them as pockets of poverty and crime. And so we sent more police in and more patrols in to deal with the problem. But in transforming the whole neighborhood and literally tearing it down and rebuilding it, you've made wholly different experiences for people that was never a policing issue. And I would imagine dramatically brought down the amount of trouble and crime and problems in those neighborhoods.
That's generally true. And I'll take a little bit of exception to Paul's comment. Initially, public housing was built to really provide transit housing for people coming back from serving in the wars. That was the original intent. Folks coming back from serving in the military, and they needed a place to live. They needed some time to reestablish themselves. But over time, Paul's absolutely correct. Public housing became the general place to warehouse poor people, to provide basically a roof over their head and hope that they could survive from that. And as you stated, when you did that, you did create these pockets of concentrated poverty that just led to all kinds of social issues and challenges that go along with having a population like that confined in a small area of space. So the whole idea about what we have been trying to do is to create a mixed income community. And I actually grew up in South Memphis. I could walk to the Moore Gardens, Clavin Homes, or Foot Homes in several minutes from where I grew up. And we lived in a mixed income community. We still had public housing, but we had all kinds of folks living in the neighborhood. And of course, that was primarily a function of segregation before neighborhoods became integrated. But nonetheless, we had all people in all walks of life living in the same neighborhoods, going to school together, going to church together, and just created a much more stable situation. And you will have people obviously on different levels of the economic spectrum, but people managed to live together. So over time that changed. And as African Americans in particular were able to move away from those neighborhoods, they did. And my family was actually one of them. And there's a lot to think about as it relates to the whole psychology behind how we moved from neighborhoods that we moved from. We didn't move out to a predominantly white neighborhood. We moved into a neighborhood that was transitioning to predominantly Black. So we still stayed in the community, if you will. But nonetheless, we left the core inner city neighborhood as many people did. So I think it's what we're trying to accomplish is create a sense of community, create a sense of vibrancy. And what I tell people all the time, and I run into this, way too many times. People talk about gentrification and you're displacing poor people. And from my perspective, that's the very last thing that we're doing, number one. And certainly there's no intention. But as I tell folks, a neighborhood that is comprised of only low income or poor people is not sustainable. You know, if you want to have the amenities that everybody wants to have in terms of a neighborhood, you have to be able to afford those amenities. That means having a combination of different income levels where people can work together, interact together, but still have an economic base that can support some of these amenities that people would like to have. So the mixed income concept is really designed to address that issue, to deconcentrate this poverty, to still afford opportunities for people that need assistance in public housing, and specifically South City. And it's actually the only one where we have a mandate by HUD, which is what dictates how we operate, that basically we have to replace every unit that was occupied by a public housing resident with a new unit. So literally every person that lived in Foot Homes, as an example, could come back to the new neighborhood if they chose to. There are that many units available that will be subsidized for people that need the help. So it's still a work in progress. We learn a lot every time we do one of these. We try to make improvements and create better environments as each subsequent project occurs.
We are short on time. So I thank you both for being here and talking about these things and sharing your thoughts. I encourage everyone to read Archie's column that he did for us. It was nice enough to reach out and do that. It's difficult, and it's a call to action for people who can make change and need to make change. Faith, Bill, Archie, thank you for joining us. Thank you all for joining us, and please join us again next week.